my work on the land is in service to the land, but it's also in service to myself, because it's not different. If the land grows, I will grow with the land. And if I grow, I will be able to serve the land in a better way. So this is where interconnectedness comes. Are we able to realize that interconnectedness, not only at an intellectual level, but as an experience? When I come onto this land, what does it evoke in me? That awe. Is it creating that in me every time that I step onto this land to grow food? And then can I transfer that to the food that I'm growing? And can that be then transferred to the people who are eating that food? And can they transfer that in making this place what it is? And can that then support all of us in growing and progressing better and learn more?
What if the ways we organise are part of the crisis that we face, and also a key to what comes next? Welcome to Organising from Elsewhere. We're exploring new ways of organising, ways of listening, moving and deciding together that can help us navigate the collapse of so much that we hold dear and work to overcome the systems of extraction and oppression. We believe that at the heart of this social, ecological, spiritual crisis is this paradigm of separation. And we're weaving a collective of activists, researchers and facilitators who are asking, what would it mean to organise from a different assumption?
An ever-evolving, emergent experiment.
Bridging the fields of science and consciousness.
Decolonizing our thinking about indigenous knowledge.
And developing somatic facilitation practices.
To bring about much needed systemic change.
This podcast series works like a game of tag. Each guest is invited to become the host for the next episode and choose for themselves a new voice to enrich this exploration.
Join us on a journey of reimagining how we work together in collectives, organizations, and social movements.
Listen into exciting and unexpected perspectives that have emerged when organizing differently.
And stay tuned until the end of the episode, where we're excited to unpack and reflect on what has been shared.
So take a deep breath and let's dive in. Enjoy this week's conversation.
Hello, my name is Niki, and today I'm sitting down with Anshul Aggarwal. He's someone that I met quite recently. He's a farmer at the AuroOrchard at Auroville. This is quite an extraordinary place that I have wanted to visit for a long time for many reasons. I've been volunteering at this farm for about a week and had a really wonderful experience, and also had some very interesting conversations briefly with Anshul. So I'm really honored to have an hour of your time to dive a bit deeper into some of the topics that we have covered. And I would love to give the floor to you to introduce yourself. And maybe in that introduction, you can also situate a bit, what is Auroville? What is AuroOrchard? Where are we right now? In the present moment, we're sitting under a pomelo tree at the AuroOrchard. So you will hear some noises of birds and insects, and yeah, it's a really beautiful spot. So yeah, over to you, Anshul.
Thanks, Niki. First of all, thanks for the invitation. The pleasure is mine. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to this conversation about where we are, how do we locate ourselves. So we are on the east coast of India in an international city called Auroville, and we're just in the neighborhood of Pondicherry. And Auroville started in 1968, founded by Mira Alfasa, who we also call the mother, based on the spiritual philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, who was an Indian freedom fighter, and later he moved to Pondicherry, and he was a yogi, philosopher, poet, and around him the Sri Aurobindo ashram was created. Mother joined him after a few years after him coming to Pondicherry, and that's like 1920s, early 1920s, and then since then the ashram got established. In early 60s, Mother was already imagining a new model of spiritual community, and she gave it the form of Auroville in 1968 that we founded here. And the goal of Auroville is basically to experiment with a new consciousness and see how that manifests on an individual and collective level, right? So this is about pushing the boundaries of what humanity is, to look at where the evolution of humanity is taking us, and see how everything organizes itself around that. Our education, our architecture, farming, just day-to-day stuff. How does beauty manifest? How does work manifest? How does social relationships manifest? How does decision making manifest in a city like that? So that's where we are in Auroville, and AuroOrchard is the oldest farm of Auroville. It was started even just before Auroville started, and mother got the land and called Gerard, who was already working with the ashram, and said, "Look, we are starting this town for a future humanity, and people are going to come from everywhere in the world, and we need to grow food for them. So will you help me grow food for Auroville?" That was a message, that was a direction, that was a mission given to Gerard for this land. So our orchard is very simply just that we are growing food for all of you. Now, what does that mean? Is a discovery in itself, and it's a process in itself of, first of all, what does food mean for community dedicated to evolution of consciousness? What does food mean to, or what does growing food mean for a community that is aspiring to grow its own consciousness, for its advancement of consciousness? So these are questions. I cannot say that we have figured all this out. We are working, we are trying to understand ourselves, what is our place in all of this. But more or less, that's our aspiration.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I would love to ground into this topic of food a bit further, as one of the quotes you had that I wrote down, which was really interesting, was food has been central in defining and being defined by human cultures. So the way we orient and organize ourselves around food historically has been very important in how we developed as civilizations, as collectives, as communities. And at the same time, our cultures now are also heavily influencing the way our food is being grown. So it's like this mutual feedback between our cultures and producing food for ourselves. And like you said, in a way, it can be very simple that what we're doing here is growing food for Auroville, but I'm sure that there's so much complexity in what that actually means in terms of how we relate to the land and what kind of culture we're trying to cultivate in connection to our food and plants and natural ecosystems that we are actually part of. And it's interesting to talk to you because, like, I understand there's probably very little answers, and we talked about this before. There's just a lot of questions, and this is completely fine and very valuable for us as organizing from elsewhere, because we're also in the phase of we need to learn by doing, and experimentation is the best form of doing that. And so being this in this experimental township as Auroville, but also in AuroOrchard that is experimenting with bringing the ideas of consciousness and the divine and spirituality together with practical things like matter and food and biology and things that nourish us. I'm really interested to be understanding what have been your questions so far, and maybe placing a bit of how long have you been in AuroOrchard, what brought you personally to this place in your journey, and yeah, what have you learned, what questions have you uncovered for yourself, and maybe what were the potentials that you saw in AuroOrchard specifically with the topics that are interesting and important to you.
So I've been in our orchard for 6 years now. And I was farming before that. I was in Himachal for a while. I was in Kodaikanal for a while. My wife and I were farming there. And then we finally decided to move to Auroville. And I think my entry into this whole thing was perhaps very selfish. I graduated as an engineer, and I was on that track of the conventional mainstream kind of a thing. And that's when I came into contact with Auroville. And I realized that 20 years of education that I've spent my life in education, but I don't know anything. And I mean, I don't know even the basics of life, like growing my food, building my house, even cooking to some extent. Like, what do we know? So I think that sort of put me on this path of like, I want to build my house, I want to grow my food, and I want to be in the mountains somewhere and not interact with this world which is going to shit. There is no redemption kind of a thing. So starting from there, I realized that I think a lot of people dream of that. The world is becoming more and more complex. The solutions are not easy. Even we don't know what the questions are anymore and what the problems are anymore. And the more we feel that we know, the more complicated it's becoming, right? So I think it makes sense. Like, yeah, if you can get out and be peaceful somewhere, you should just do that. The problem with that is that, first of all, obviously it doesn't change anything. The world is still the same. And second, there is no growth there. So I was feeling like I'm not engaging in the world, but I'm still forced to engage with the world, right? So I can't completely be cut off also. So I'd rather than participate than being a passive sort of, because you can't just be completely passive also, right? So that was my sort of dilemma. That was a tension. And from being this backyard gardener to, okay, I will grow my food and I will just do my thing, I thought that I needed to learn a bit more about agriculture. Like, what does growing food really mean? And I had questions about who's farming and what kind of knowledge is there, what kind of knowledge is being shared now, how do farmers know what they know, or to know how have they come up with all this stuff. So that took me on a journey of a lot of travel, meeting different farmers, different indigenous cultures. I think the farming situation in the world is quite dire. First of all, like you said, there is this changing culture that we're all going through, and that is changing our food. Food today is not something that is seen as sacred, it's a commodity, right? So it's something that you just buy. If you have enough money, you can buy food and you can eat it. There's a figure about 1 out of 7 people in this world are suffering from malnutrition or hunger. And the complementary figure for that is 1 out of 7 people is obese, right? So it's not about lack of food, it's just a problem of distribution. And as long as food is linked with money and stays like a commodity, somebody will always have less access to it. So it's not just about self sufficiency, but it's also about a relationship with land, a relationship with our bodies, a relationship with even our communities, right? So it's now we're getting interested in organic food that because you want to be healthy, but still, food is not just about keeping us healthy. It's a very vital part of our relationship to everything else outside of us. I mean, in the Western religion, we have the story of Christ transmutating his body as bread and his blood as wine. And when the Catholics, they have the communion, when they eat the bread and eat the wine, it's like an offering to the Christ. In Eastern traditions, you have this idea of, in the Vedas, you have the sacrifice of the animals, right? So there is an offering. So the animals are food for the people, right? These are offerings to the god. So I'm not justifying the ritual idea around animal ethics and all of that, but I'm just saying that the consciousness of food has developed over time from this idea of sacrifice of the body as an offering to something much higher than us, right? So when we eat something, it's a sacrifice of whatever we are eating to the divine, which is in our body, to the divine, which is outside of us. So if you look at that principle of food, we're completely lost today. Yeah. We don't even have enough time to eat. Now we have business lunches, which you can do in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. We have all these rapid service providers who bring food very quickly and then you can eat it quickly and then you can just get on with the work. So definitely there's a huge change in the culture of food. How does it impact our consciousness? How does it redefine what human being is a question.
Yeah.
Right? So when I came to Auroville, I think immediately when I heard the story about mother asked AuroOrchard to grow food for Auroville, I had this question like, okay, what does it really mean when you say grow food for a community like this? That really allowed me to imagine a bit more and say, okay, maybe we can look at food as a vehicle of consciousness, as a vehicle of even evolution of consciousness, and not just something material, not just something 100 kilos of something, right? What kind of energy am I putting in the food? And even a farmer, what kind of aspiration does the farmer have when they are growing the food, right? They're not just tilling the land and producing something and giving it away. Their life, their blood, their sweat, their energy is embodied in the food. So the farmers are actually not only just giving care to the land, but also giving life to food in a way and offering this as the sacrifice of their own bodies to the community, right? So I think those are the kind of questions on how do we do this with full awareness, mindfulness, and what does it mean? What does self-sacrifice mean in today's time for food, for community? Those are the kind of questions that I meditate on, I contemplate.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on the vastness that is actually in these basic necessities that we cannot even create systemic structures around to provide to people as a basic need. But even besides the fact that this is something that we need just to nourish ourselves and survive, it's also the energy that we put into our body. And like the fact that what we put in as part of who we are is something that I feel is not really visible in how we relate to food or how food is centered around our societies. As like you said, it's a commodity, when actually, if you take this idea of the divine consciousness, it means that there is this interconnection between what we are putting inside and our entire being, and that there is no separation between this, as we are living, breathing organisms. And when you spend time in a farm like this, for example, it becomes very apparent that everything around is part of who we are. And I feel that in Auroville or in AuroOrchard in general, there is that relationality with our food systems, because in the West, I have been involved in many agricultural, agroecological initiatives, and there is like this practical dimension in everything still. Even if we are trying to transform how we're producing food and creating complex systems and trying to work with nature, we still don't see nature as something that we are actively part of and contributing in. And this is where this spiritual felt sense of interconnectedness actually circulates here in ways that I don't necessarily feel that much in my previous experiences, or like this is something that feels quite taboo to bring into a system oriented around providing a need to human beings. So I'm curious how you find that, as we describe it as interconnectedness, but I'm sure there's a lot of words that you can use that are different. To how do you bring that into how we produce food? And yeah, I guess I'm curious about also how you are organizing yourselves in this farm, specifically around that as an idea, and what can we learn from being in direct contact with the land into how we can organize our human cultures, or what are the next steps in doing that, of like reintegrating back to living systems and us being a part of that.
Yeah, so I have been farming now for 11 years, and I have been in touch with the soil. I have learned more about myself than farming. I think there is, you talked about interconnectedness. There is this whole sort of new view of eco psychology, which is talking about, of course, interconnectedness. We're all the same, panpsychism, or whatever you want to call it. I think you can look at it from different perspectives, right? One, you can look at it purely from energetics, that we are all energy. Energy is transforming from one form to the other. And this tree is energy, I'm energy, the soil is energy, and yeah, we're just sort of moving, right? So we're all the same anyway. Um,
Or I'm curious if be the same is what it's not necessarily what I mean by interconnectedness, because of course we're all not the same. And that was also something that was brought up in some of your sharings of like in Auroville there is this sense of like human unity and like this idea of we're all the same, but through farming you realize that yeah, there are hierarchies and there are differences and there's diversity, and maybe tweaking this sense of interconnectedness doesn't necessarily mean we're all the same, but what does that actually mean in your words?
yeah. So I think, yeah, the perspective there is about niches, right? In ecology, we talk about niches. Every element in a system has its own niche, right? And it's not about what is up, what is above, what is lower, and what is better or worse or whatever. It's just a different niche for each and every element. And I think if we look at the natural systems, or let's say a tree as a tree, and say that's its niche, a tree grows for 50 years, 100 years, it gives abundant fruit, has deep roots, creates shade, creates a different kind of microclimate, and can facilitate making a forest, etc. That's its niche. We have to realize what is our niche in the natural system, right? So we have a role in the natural system. I mean, farming, we talk about natural farming. Farming is not natural. Farming itself is not natural. So this whole idea of natural farming is a paradox. If human beings decided to create a kind of system where they can cultivate what they want to eat rather than just taking from the wild and foraging, then that is part of our evolution. That's part of our consciousness of where we want to go with this relationship, right? And how do you do that? So we have somehow also learned to do that in a good way. Amazon is probably a very good example. It's a man-made forest. So how did we do that? And how are we able to then, in the last 60 years, 100 years, 200 years, able to destroy our soils in the way that we had? And how are we reaching a point where our soils are not producing anything, where the farmers are suffering, where the communities are suffering, where the whole culture of food is deteriorating, right? So I think the part of interconnectedness is to realize that we have a role of service in this whole system. Of course, we are serving our communities because we need, as farmers, we are growing food for them. So we need to look at what is it that the community needs? What can I grow that will give the maximum nourishment in terms of biology, in terms of even the spiritual food, just to keep our communities together and alive. I have also a relationship of service to the land, because this is what is offering. This is, like I said about the sacrifice, right? Is a sacrifice of the land to give this as an offering to us as part of the divine. So what am I sacrificing for the land? What is my offering to the land? Right. So I think it's really about shifting from a sense of exploitation and sense of I can take this from the land to a sense of service. That what am I offering as service to the land? Because the connection is there, the interconnectedness is there. I think now it's fairly is been talked about in different ways and a lot. So I don't think there's anybody who's questioning the interconnectedness of these elements. I think what is the relationship like? So even within an interconnection, there is a relationship. What are the attributes of the relationship? I think those are important to define, or at least question and explore and nuance them a bit more and add maybe a new kind of vocabulary to that to understand that better. So, okay, also you brought up the idea of human unity in Auroville and the idea of sameness. Like I said, there are niches. So to say that everybody is equal, I think is again in disservice to the community, because everybody is not equal. Some people, some elements in the system need much more care than the others. We all have privilege to the extent that sometimes we don't even know. So to deny that completely and say everybody is the same is not very helpful. I think the idea of human unity is also not that people are always together. I think the human unity, that the way I understand, is it's a unity of the human with something much higher than the human. Because if you have that unity, then everything else is unified anyway, right? I don't think we can create human unity on a social level. You can't do that. It's impossible. That human unity on a social level will only come if there is human unity at a spiritual level. Because things start there. The transformation starts there. And then it trickles down to all these mundane, practical, material life. And most of our problems are related to us feeling that we can somehow create an intervention in the social structures and that will bring about a change. But it doesn't work. I have not seen, maybe for a very short time, but it's not sustainable, because we fall back into the same psychological pattern. We fall back into the same mindsets, which has not changed, right? Which is not transformed. And for that transformation, something else is required completely.
Something else.
Something else from somewhere else.
Somewhere else. Can you speak into a bit more into what that is, or does it feel completely like out of reach or out of grasp?
I don't think it's out of reach. I think we all have experience of that. I mean, have you had an experience where you were completely overwhelmed by something? Not in a bad way, of course, could be bad also, but like just beauty or something that you see and you just, has that happened to you?
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for me, I've had some of those experiences, and that sort of gives us a glimpse of something that is completely beyond us. And what is happening to us in that moment also is not something that we can articulate, right? It's an experience which is very, very strange. What is happening could be something mundane, could be something extraordinary, but our response to it is something completely inexplicable, right? So that's one thing. And I also think that a spiritual experience is not something completely out of bounds. It just needs, I think, some kind of, it needs a cultivation of, can be a practice, can be an openness, can be listening, quietening down the mind, the body, our thoughts, whatever. Different things work for different people. But I think we have to be open for it, because it's already there, right? It's not like we have to wait for the thunder to strike or something. It's always already there. It's about, and it's not about waiting for something to happen. I think the work is on us. Can I prepare myself to experience that as often as possible, as much as possible? And what do I need to do for that? So the practice will be very different for me and it'll be very different for you because you have your culture, background, conditioning, biases, on all of that. And I have my own stuff going on. So I think it's a kind of a higher intuitive power that we need to cultivate, which we have glimpses of. I think, and now more and more people are getting glimpses of that because I think collectively humanity is sort of ripe for this to happen, or at least we're getting there somehow. So this is a good time for that. But yeah, are we able to use that opportunity is a question. How do we somehow enhance the possibilities on a collective level for these opportunities to show up?
Mm.
No? Yeah.
Yeah. You always end with the exact question where I'm like, now can you answer that question, please? Because this is our question as well. It's like, what are the spaces and like the cultures that we're trying to cultivate, understanding that we have very deep constraints in really creating systems that flourish in a way of like what you've been talking about, of this feeling of awe or overwhelm. It almost sounds like a trance state. And I'm sure many people have that experience in many different forms and have different words to describe that. But I'm like, how do we create such a state in a way that we can also use that not as a separate experience that we then have as one off, but how do we bring this feeling? And I think a lot of what you're talking about of being in service and understanding that there's forces and balances that you are actively part of can help us feel connected to that feeling more on an individual self, but also how to bring that more to the collective, which was the question that you ended with. And that's why I'm more interested in places like Auroville, which in many ways are offering something around that. But I also understand that there are similarly constraints here and things that don't work and certain limitations. And yeah, maybe instead of answering how to do this, we can also bring into question what is holding us back. Or specifically in Auroville, what are the things that are also limiting of the idea that the mother in Sri Aurobindo had then. And many people that I speak to are like, we're not there yet. We're trying our best, but something is still holding us back. So yeah, you being here much longer than I am, I'm curious if you have anything to share around that.
Yeah, it's probably right. Like we're not there yet. And everything that I'm saying, I'm including myself in it. I'm not saying that I've figured it out and I'm completely in sync with everything that is happening. Our ego is still quite strong and we need a strong ego, but a lot is going on in our world right now. Socially, culturally, politically, biologically. There's just so much that to put everything into perspective, it's very challenging, especially when you're coming from the paradigm of the mind, right? Which is, the legacy of our generation. And like we've taken that, right? We grew up in that paradigm of completely just believing everything that we can address through the mind. Our education is completely that. So there are a lot of things that we cannot understand. There are a lot of things that we cannot imagine if we just bind ourselves to the limitations of the mind. Can we move beyond that? Yes, we can. But again, how do we unlearn this whole thing? Right? And we need a lot of help, we need a lot of support. And for that, we need a community. So I think where Auroville is, I think that's why also Mother created Auroville. It was not like to invite people who have a higher consciousness. It was to create a setting where people can experiment with. So when you're in a community, you can support each other with certain things. Because how do you unlearn mental logic? You have to just work, right? And you have to show that you can work from a different space, that you can create from a space which is beyond the mind. This is what people have done here in the last 50 years. People have just created. They've created forests, they've created buildings, they've created projects, whatever, right? Soaps and paper and all sorts of creative explorations have happened with something else in mind, not just mental logic. So I think a community like Auroville is very, very valuable from that perspective. Where it doesn't work is that even though we are experimenting with all that, we are still human beings and we are still confronted with our own challenges and limitations. And we are not completely outside of that. So we still have social issues, we have issues of discrimination, we have issues of not being able to take decisions collectively, or even we have this aspiration that we are going to take decisions in consensus. But what does consensus really mean? How can we ensure that consensus is not imposed on the marginal voices? So there are a lot of questions there, and I think it requires a lot of patience, a lot of committed and continuous work on these issues. So I think for Auroville also, this is a stage where probably this is happening. Like Auroville went from this sort of ecological, a lot of work in the first 30 years, 40 years was around ecology, right? Just to create an environment so that people could actually just be. There needed to be a material comfort somewhere, right? Because otherwise the basic needs of life were not available. Once that was done, I think Auroville is then moving towards the social. Like there was a lot in the last 10 years, a lot of work has been done on decision making and how do communities come together and talk about different topics and how to discuss and etc. etc. The events of the last couple of years in Auroville have disrupted the natural flow and something else is happening, which is part of the same movement. But the main question right now in Auroville is about how does Auroville organize itself? Whether with the government, without the government, with people, without the people, whatever it is, how does the organization of Auroville work? And I think once that has been figured out a little bit to some extent, just the basic day to day stuff, then we can probably focus on something more. So, Auroville is a long project. So, I don't imagine this will come easy. I think you were saying, like, how is this possible on a collective level? I think we need more and more communities of learning. Not just talking, because we also have the need of sharing. And we see that now quite a bit on social media, that people come together spontaneously and they talk about stuff that they care about. But I think we need communities that are based on creating, even if they're not living together. Because in that creation, I think there's a different experience than just share reflective, right? So once we do that, I think we can experiment with these new ideas and new forms of knowing. We were talking about initially a different ontology. And I think a different ontology is only possible with a different epistemology completely, right? So what are those epistemologies and how do I know that I have access to these ways of knowing, different ways of knowing? So that can only come in practice while experimenting and stuff. And I think if we have a community that learns together, these things can be worked on, which is something that Auroville offers.
Yeah. Very nice bridge, because part of what we're really actively exploring, there is this whole facilitation framework that we want to develop and like how to incorporate these different ways of knowing. But a whole part of the project is actually how do we listen and learn differently than how we are socialized and educated to do so, in a way that whatever new experiences we have, we don't take them and assimilate them into the same patterns of knowing that we have grown up with. And yeah, this is part of the project that I find my heart is in as well, where a lot of steps have to be taken back before we start feeling like we're ready to integrate this new knowledge. Is like, firstly, how do we make space for challenging every single thing we know? And how do we listen from a place without assimilating anymore? And this is where working with communities of different ontologies, of these ontologies of interconnectedness that are, for them, this is not something to teach. This is just a way of existing and living and being. So us, that we are like starting to understand the value of that, trying that out ourselves, but also creating power structures where we are extracting and exploiting knowledge in different ways of knowing from indigenous communities. How do we do that is a question that we have that is really big right now. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about food being a commodity. Even knowledge has become a commodity, right? So experiences have become commodities. So we have this whole generation which wants to experience everything, wants to travel everywhere, and we can be 100,000 things today, right? So I think the question is, what do we really need to know? And yeah, and what do you do with knowledge? What do you do with that? Once you have that knowledge, what do you do with it? Because knowledge in the way that we know of knowledge right now is already there. Everything is there. On YouTube, on internet, you can find each and everything. AI is giving you all sorts of things. I think what AI doesn't have is the creative power, right? So if knowledge is used to create something, I think that has value. And again, creation with this mindset of service, right? So when we come back to the same thing, creation for what? Not creation again to feed the same commodity consumption cycle, but creation and service to something. So then we have the world in front of us, we can access indigenous cultures. How does that knowledge apply to what I want to create? What is the authenticity that I'm offering to the world, right? And what is the knowledge that I need to be able to do that work in the best possible manner? Then it has some context, then it has some meaning. So I think the biggest sort of question in front of us would be then, what is the purpose for each and every one of us, right? Because the kind of knowledge that you will need in your life is different from the kind of knowledge I need in my life. And the way you will acquire that knowledge will depend on the kind of knowledge that you need, right? And we can only do that if we know what we are working towards. And that again comes from a community of learning where everybody feels safe to express themselves, to explore themselves, to try out different things, to experiment, and so on. Our culture of education is not that at all. We are being asked to become standardized, follow rules, follow norms that are set by somebody somewhere for whatever reason, right? So, individual expression, even though we are a completely individualistic culture right now, the expression of the individual is not there. We are scared of that also. We're kind of a very strict collective of individuals where we maintain a certain kind of individualism, but it has to maintain only in that form because otherwise it threatens our capitalist system. Right? It is not completely, individual is not completely free. It is bound by the capitalist forces and the framework that it offers. So there's this conversation about, oh, our culture is very individualistic and we need to move towards collectivism and all of that. I think there is some truth to that. But I think if you really take individualism to extreme and you talk about individual freedom, we are nowhere close to that. Nowhere close to that. Is everybody in this world able to express themselves in the way they need to express themselves? I don't think so. I don't think so. So I think we need to re-question this idea of what is individualism and how can we create a collective where individualism is possible, because we need to express ourselves, otherwise we are not going to keep quiet just because you're in collective.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of attention being like the individual is a bad thing. This is like underpinning the separation that we're experiencing on many different levels. But it's also like if I look back into natural systems and agriculture, farming, or like a forest, I'm also thinking there are certain individuals there, but how are they connecting and what relationship do they have? Like they are an individual, but that would not exist without the relationships that are there around supporting that individual. But that doesn't mean the individual is out there. Like a plant maybe can be considered an individual, maybe not. Also, subjective question, but yeah, I'm wondering how does that translate, like how we can again listen and learn from natural systems and see them as guides on how we can also create social and cultural systems where humans are the center of this. Speaking into this idea of individual but connected to a collective, but actually what it boils down to is relationality. And also, you mentioned earlier, like this idea of plurality. So maybe you can speak more into that.
Yeah, so if you look at the natural systems, a tree expresses itself in a very different way from a bird or from a herb or a grass or a weed or whatever. And again, this does not make the tree better or worse than anything else. Right? It's just in Indian philosophy, there's this word called swadharma. It's one's own dharma. Right? Like the dharma of fire is to burn, the dharma of water is to flow. So if you stop this, if you constrain this, if you limit this, there will be some trauma in that system. Right? The energy is not going to flow, harmony is not going to happen. Right? So even in individual systems, social systems, human systems, each person has his or her own swadharma. And This is also part of, Auroville's goal to allow people to grow here and develop their own Swadharma. And I think this is something that we can learn from nature. You can learn this from also, especially in Indian philosophy, there's a lot of conversation about this. How each and every element that is created is a divine manifestation in that form. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the tree becomes a tree, and there's a reason why I become who I am and you become who you are. And it's our responsibility then to take this manifestation to its highest culmination, right? So by curtailing your freedom, by not allowing you to express yourself fully, what am I actually stopping? I'm stopping my own manifestation. So this is where interconnectedness comes. Are we able to realize that interconnectedness not only at an intellectual level, but as an experience, where your growth, your progress, your manifestation is linked to my growth, my progress, my manifestation. And the same way, the growth of the land, the health of the land is linked to my health. Not because it's giving me food that I eat and then I'm okay, but just as a whole, as an integral view, having a land which is healthy in terms of its vegetation, in terms of its soil, whatever that is, right? When I come onto this land, what does it evoke in me? That awe, right? Is it creating that in me every time that I step onto this land to grow food? And then can I transfer that to the food that I'm growing? And can that be then transferred to the people who are eating that food? And can they transfer that in making this place what it is? And can that then support all of us in growing and progressing better and more and learn more? So it's really about, first of all, understanding that our evolution is linked to each other. I cannot suddenly become enlightened and be on top of a mountain while everybody else is suffering. We are in a collective evolutionary process, and our progress is very deeply linked to the progress of everything else. So my work on the land is in service to the land, but it's also in service to myself, because it's not different. If the land grows, I will grow with the land. And if I grow, I will be able to serve the land in a better way, right? And this is also the game between individual and collective. If the individual is growing, what is collective? Collective is just a collection of the individuals. So if the individual grows, the collective grows. And if the collective is growing, it should be able to allow the individual to grow as well, right? So I feel like this whole conversation about collectivism, individualism, I don't think there should be any imposition. I think people are at very different levels of evolution, very different levels of growth and progress. And there should be space for each and every person to explore that. If they want to take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, then that's how it is. And you can't force this. We can't change people. We can change ourselves. We can try to change ourselves. That's all that we have in our hands, right? And perhaps we can create a culture, we can create an organization, we can create a community, we can create a space where other people can come in and feel supported to do the same, right? To explore themselves, to, if they want to change or if they want to learn something, they're able to do that. I think finally, that's all that is in our hands in terms of our participation in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's also a bit humbling to be aware of the fact that evolution happens naturally, and there is this paradigm of like, I need to change something, I need to change this person, and then this person will change this, and then the world will change in this direction that we so deeply feel is needed. But yeah, there's also something around the humility of like, we are evolving, and there are cultural movements that are happening, and you mentioned this previously, that it feels, and a lot of people are feeling, I think, that we are in it right now. And there is like this hospicing what needs to naturally die off, and then creating the seeds of renewal of something maybe not even completely new, something from before and something new, and all of these things merging together to create a natural progression of where we are going. And I guess my last question would be more looking into the vision of like, how do you see this cultural evolution moving towards, or like this idea of human evolution? What are we evolving into in relationships, maybe to the land, but also beyond? Yeah, maybe we can end a bit of like a sea of looking forward as well.
Yeah. Sri Aurobindo, in his sort of exploration of human evolution, he believed that human being is not the last rung of the ladder of evolution, and we will be surpassed, right? And we have to be, because we are not perfect. We are making all these mistakes and we are struggling so much for basic stuff. And nature is not stupid. I mean, look around us, right? So all this has happened over the last 4 billion years, apparently. We did not decide that we had to come from chimpanzees. We did not decide that life had to be created. This is not human beings doing it. So nature itself is creating more and more complexity. So it will happen at some point. Whether human beings are going to be part of it or not is a question, right? And there again, I think we talk about self-sustenance and we have to maintain humanity. Why? If it is not required in the natural evolution of things, then yeah, maybe human beings are not going to be part of it. Something else will be. So that is one thing. But even within the paradigm of the human, we are being asked to push our boundaries, right? We are being asked to, like we talked about this idea of the mind, we are being asked to expand what our mind is, expand our ontology, expand our epistemology. So there is this idea of the post-human, what is coming after the human. So there are different ways of looking at post-human as well. You can think of post-human as post-human centrism, like where everything is not centered around the human. So a paradigm where we are in service, we are in relationship to everything, part of the system, but not necessarily at the center of it. But also post our definition of what human is, like the fundamental meaning of what it means to be human, which is this body, this mind, our social structures, families, our profession, our career, whatever we have developed over the last how many ever million years to understand as what is human, right? I don't know what it is going to be. I think we are seeing a deep need for that, a deep dissatisfaction with the way things are, and a preparedness, at least mentally, spiritually, to say that this is enough. We need something else completely. We don't have the answer. And also, we don't have the answer because we are still using the mental logic to come up with that answer, which is not going to happen. Like, we are going to create the same things again and again. So, and we are doing that also. We're trying, we're failing, and then we're trying the same thing and something else and we're failing. But I think it's a part of the process. We are getting there through all this trial and error. Finally, like I said, I think it's about being open to the possibilities, because if nature is evolving and if nature is creating all these mutations, changes, why do we have to take all the responsibility? If we could just do our thing and keep ourselves available to change, then perhaps change will happen. I think we put in too much investment in having things in a certain way. And sometimes that messes with the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
Right. So this is what I also meant, the idea of, like, when you were asking why things don't work in Auroville, there is still our ego there, because we have invested so much here. Not me personally, but people have invested so much here, their life, their entire being, right? So sometimes you're attached to that idea of like what it means when you have given 30, 40, 50 years of your life, or even 10, 5 years, 3 years of your life. You want it to go in a certain way, where you want Auroville to become this. But how do we know it has to become this only and not something else? So I think this requires a very different mindset where we are constantly just open to anything, all the possibilities. And perhaps this is one of the qualities of the post-human, that you're always available for change, always available for something to work through you and create something else which you have not imagined, which you cannot comprehend even. Yeah. And again, that's something that can be in our hands. Everything else is going to be just intellectual work of thinking what it can be, I feel. So knowing that our control is limiting and it is not creating something good for us, right? So to give up control and then let's see what happens. So this is what we try to do a little bit on the farm as well.
Yeah.
There is a vision, there is planning, we have a plan every day and we know what direction we want to take. But we try also to be open to things and to life. And yeah, we have a big team. So nature is working through all of them. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. Again, how do I know what is good and what is not good? But I feel that's a very rewarding process of learning.
Great. Yeah, part of that openness that you've spoken about, it's been quite an invitation really for me and other volunteers to really to see what can happen through us being in this place in this specific time, see what can emerge. And you have offered the opportunity for emergence, and that has been a bit of like, it's a confronting to do that as well, because you're like, but what you want to know, what is the value, what am I delivering, what will be done with this? And sometimes it is just sitting with the fact that we don't know, but whatever is happening because of where we are right now, and that has a value. So yeah, I see this conversation as a product of a beautiful space for emergence that you have offered, and my opportunity to be here. And I thank you very much for making a time for it. Yeah, if there's anything else you want to share, otherwise I'm happy to close.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, for offering your energy and time. And yeah, I think one part of this community of learning is dialogue. We need to keep talking, and talking not just in a manner of talking, but also dialoguing and conversing with each other, with the environment, developing a different kind of language also to understand and to experience all of this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope this conversation has been as fascinating for you as it was for us. If this episode moved you in some way, we would be curious to hear your insights and intuitions. And if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, be interviewed or suggest a guest, do reach out to us on socials at Organising From Elsewhere or at org_elsewhere. Follow us and connect with a community of practice, a growing network of social movements and regenerative initiatives. Do spread the seeds of this needed conversation by sharing it with a friend who might find it meaningful. And if you'd like to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is give us a rating so more people can discover us. See you next time. Thank you.